I have had the wonderful opportunity over the last couple of hours to drive Eve around and have had a great conversation, and so I'm going to try and have that conversation again with you now. Because the issues
I'll say all different things.
Yeah, totally screwed. We'll be talking about identity and anti-Zionism and the strength of Jewish community and all the rest of it, and it's just been wonderful. Earlier today we went to Mount Scopus and we spoke to the students there. We're going to see the other three of the other schools over the next day or two, and it's really, and as you'll know in the next half hour, Eve's message is brilliant for young people. But let's start with before all of this started. You're from Scotland. You're a music journo. Can you give us how did that happen?
How did I become a music journalist?
Yeah.
I really scared the shit out of my parents. I was a very good, regular Jewish kid from Glasgow, very scholastic, very into academia. I was given the holy grail choice of doctor or lawyer, and I decided I was going to become a lawyer because I was very good at literature and all these other things that I enjoyed that equaled becoming a lawyer as opposed to going and studying the things I enjoyed to study. So I went to school in Manchester from 2004 to 2007, and I graduated during the height of a recession, and it was a really precarious time to be a university graduate, and my heart wasn't really in the legal profession, but I, did what any rationally minded graduate did at that time and tried to apply and become a lawyer and get a training contract at a firm, and they just didn't exist at that point and they weren't hiring. And so I went back to Glasgow with my tail between my legs and looked around my bookshelves. I was having a kind of premature life crisis and wondering what on earth I was going to do with my life. And I noticed that I didn't really have many books in my shelves. I just had an archive of music magazines that were my Bibles growing up, and that I was obsessed with. Music was always kind of like another character in my life, and it was really a pipe dream to ever enter that industry or do anything involved in music. But I just kind of thought, well, I played by the rules. I did everything right. I tried to be a good Jewish kid and become a lawyer, and it didn't work. So I'm going to go downstairs and tell my dad that I will follow rock bands around the world for my career, and I wound up doing that instead. So that's the Cliff Notes version.
And then you were in LA, and I think, if I'm not wrong, let's call them the troubles. Your troubles started vis-a-vis where you are now because of a tweet you sent out during the Black Lives Matter movement. Is that right? No,
it happened in phases. I began talking about anti-Semitism in a very public way in 2015. I moved to LA in 2014. I previously held a very sought-after position in London. I was the deputy editor of the New Musical Express, and at that time NME was basically one of the biggest music titles in the world, and I was running the magazine. And along with that job came a certain type of identity, which I actually completely accepted and felt I identified with. I was very liberally minded, very artistic, adjacent human being who all of my friends were in these really exciting, indie and rock bands, and some of them were rappers, people in all different genres of music, but we all shared this kind of community spirit of being progressive, and we were going to make the world a better place, we were going to find something to scream and shout about. And I noticed in London where I lived in East London. I was living in the city because, I was working. I wasn't living the Jewish part of town, I'll put it that way. I was living in the part of town you live in when you're a music journalist and you're going to multiple gigs a night and you're hanging out with reprobates. And I was basically noticing around where I lived that there was a lot of Jewish anti-Semitic graffiti, and I was noticing this more and more, and I was also noticing that I would go to my local branch of Tesco's, which is a massive supermarket chain in the UK, and the aisles where kosher meat were stocked were cleaned out. And I was wondering why this was happening, and I remember asking a teller, I think, at the Tesco's one day, why is there no where's the kosher meat at? Where did it go? Oh, we're doing this boycott thing against Israeli produce right now, so there's no kosher meat. And I actually went away that night and Googled where, I can't remember the name of the brand, but where it was manufactured and made, and it was made in Kent, which is outside of London. Which, is extremely demonstrative of this. It's a great metaphor for this issue at large. So I moved to LA, and I didn't move just because of anti-Semitism, but there was a whole group of reasons why I moved. But that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I just kind of felt like something was happening in London, and it was getting worse. And it was also affecting my community, and I thought, well, maybe if I go to LA, I can be in the music community, and I can write about music, and this isn't something that's important to people there. And so in 2015, after I had been there for about 3 or 4 months, I wrote an article for Grazia magazine, which is a huge fashion title in Europe. And I can't remember the exact title of the article, but it was something like, Why I Left the UK, according to kind of the opinion of a scared Jewish woman. And I addressed for the first time publicly these matters of anti-Semitism that I was witnessing, and this kind of clash that I felt within myself of how I could continue to move through the community, the society, and the career path that I was moving through, while also being a proud Jew and talking about anti-Semitic behaviour and rhetoric that I wasn't prepared to put up with. And at that point, it initiated the beginnings of what I would see waves after waves after waves of over time, where I had some former colleagues who said, wow, you're so brave for saying this, and I'm hearing you and I'm listening and I'm shocked, but I'm listening to you, versus some people who had a very violent reaction of, why are you censoring this? This is absurd. This is not real. There's no way that this is the reason. I know why you left London, and it's got nothing to do with this, So I immediately met with that, those polar opposite reactions. And the heat got worse when Corbynism became more and more prevalent. For anyone who doesn't know, there was a man who came to be the leader of the Labour Party, which is the natural vote of a leftist in the UK. And Jeremy Corbyn controlled the Labour Party for a number of years, up until a UK general election in 2019. And under his governing of his party, there were quite a lot of reports of anti-Semitic incidents that were being brushed under the carpet. And Jeremy Corbyn himself, as a character, had a couple of sort of nefarious social connections, let's put it that way, and a history of being militant in a way that a lot of people in this room would probably recognise. Is it won't be a surprise when you learn that he might have a slight reaction to Israel existing. So, and I got involved in that fight. I was in America, and I started to work with a cabal, if you like, of British Jews, who a lot of us went under pseudonyms, or had sub accounts on Twitter and didn't use our real names. I used my real name, which has always garnered an extra level of attention, obviously, because it makes you very easy to target. But during that, I definitely met with the first real waves of this antagonistic reaction towards me from people that I used to work with, or other young, like, fashionista type people who had very loud voices. But again, as Americans, Americans are very inward looking, as we all know, and they don't really pay that much attention, so I kind of got away with all of this while I was living in America. And yes, and then I saw iterations of the exact same echo was happening in political spaces in America. And by the time George Floyd was killed, and the BLM riots were happening, and the woke movement was really in full force, I said some things that I was no longer afraid to say, because I'd had my dress rehearsal with Corbynism, and I'd been flying this flag and speaking this for many years by this point. I was no longer afraid, and I think I was less afraid and more prepared than a lot of my American peers around me. And so I bore the brunt of a pretty brutal reaction during that summer.
Can I take you back to that Grazia magazine article?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you write it? In that, were you surprised by the outcome, that the waves, as you say, that the people that said that, you know, they were attacked you for it? Were you surprised by that? But also, you know, I mean, you could have chosen not to.
Sure.
And
at the time, there was a conversation happening under the, I think it was Theresa May, who was then the Prime Minister, was having conversations about anti-Semitism in the UK. And I think I'd been quiet for quite a few years. I saw waves of anti-Semitism when I was in university in the mid-2000s. And I was part of the on-campus Jewish Society, and I did my bit to, you know, rebel against that, or, you know, make a little bit of resistant noise against it. But I wasn't that involved. And then I got my head down and I just started working really hard and just did, you know, I already had other battles. I was the only woman in my office in music journalism for 4 years, and I was younger than everyone by about 20 years. So I contended with a lot of prejudice when I was coming up in my career, and I really didn't have a lot of time for anything else. I was a young person living in London trying to make a name for myself in a very competitive industry, and I wasn't thinking about my Jewishness. But while I was working, I graduated to this position of Deputy Editor of the NME in 2012. I was the youngest ever Deputy Editor of the NME, and you know, it was a big deal. It was a splash in the trade papers, and I became a name around London. And when I was at NME, I really wanted to change the tact of the magazine. It had always been a place where, you know, young, skinny jeaned white men in really banal sounding bands had done really well. And at that time, the streaming industry and the way that music had changed in terms of the way people digest music, there was a great visibility diversification. And I wanted the magazine to reflect that. I thought, well, if we're going to survive as a music magazine, we need to put different looking people on the cover. And you know, I really fought for diversification of the magazine. I really fought for representation of black and brown people on the cover. I really fought for representation of women on the cover. And I fought in the industry to have better representation of women in festival lineups, because notoriously women never headline music festivals. And I did all of this work, and I was involved in the, you know, David Hirsch calls it the community of the good. He's a British academic who writes a lot about left-wing anti-Semitism. And I was a fully fledged member of the community of the good. I was doing all of this work to make the world a better place, and fighting all of these battles for other communities and for other multitudes that I hold in myself. But I realized during this time and during all of this kind of atmosphere that I was feeling in London as I approached my departure from the city, that I really wasn't doing anything about this other facet of my identity. And I think when given the opportunity to speak about it, I thought, you know what, it's time. I've proven myself as someone who is an ally to all of these other fights. And people know that I'm a progressive. They know that I'm all for battling other forms of prejudice. So why is there no room to talk about the prejudice that affects my Jewishness?
And why is that prejudice rejected?
Because it's so misunderstood. And I think because, you know, at the end of the day, anti-Semitism is the oldest form of prejudice in the world, and it predates all of these other prejudices. Aside from misogyny, actually, I think misogyny probably beats out, but, you know, half of the world are female. If we're talking about the oldest form of prejudice that affects the minority community, it's anti-Semitism, hands down. And it's so wildly misunderstood, but not only is it misunderstood, but how much access do people have to real understanding and how much willingness. And once you start to scratch the surface of this, you realize how institutionalized the hatred and the suspicion around Jews is, and the lack of willingness to really learn about Jew hatred and where it comes from, and how it mutates itself through every generation, just in the slight, you know, to slightly moves to the side in every generation to look a little bit different, you know. And I think that's why it's rejected, but it's also rejected because Jews don't fit into any of these new theories. So it's much harder to, it's much easier to erase us from the process. You know, if we look at America and the rise of, or the, not the rise, but the reclamation of these race theories that we're now using as the prism by which to look at everything, whether it involves race or not. Jews don't fit into that race theory because we're not, you know, we're an ethno-religion.
As in the right says that Jews aren't white, and the left says Jews are white.
Yes, exactly. So it's I think it's much more attractive for people to just ignore us, or to just try to not create a conversation around our identity, because it's too much hassle, because it's so much easier to view the world in a binary. And all of our sociopolitics has become obsessed with binary, and Jews cannot fit into either side of any of these conversations. So we find ourselves as, you know, 0.02% of the world population, few of us who exist in these spaces, trying to get people to engage in a far more nuanced dialogue in a world where everything has to fit into a 280 character tweet. It's very, very difficult to get people to, you know, to try and turn off their emotional response and start thinking. And I think a lot of the anti-Semitism, or the ignoring that I have experienced, has been because of an emotional response of, you know, almost maybe an imposter syndrome. I don't know. I try to see the benefit of, you know, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt and see the best in them, because I don't want to believe that people are inherently anti-Semitic or that they're inherently bad. But the lack of willingness to really sit down and listen to me is appalling, and I have to try and figure out why that is. And I think some of it is an emotional reaction pertaining to ignorance and lack of confidence, and also truly maybe just an inherent suspicion of what a Jew has to say.
And we were talking earlier about how, you know, for 20 years I've been trying to rationalise why people are obsessed by Israel, and I keep coming back to this conclusion that they're just inherently anti-Semitic, even if it doesn't sit well with it. So how do you know, it's very easy to speak to a room full of Jews and say, I faced all this anti-Semitism, and everyone in there gets it, right? How do you convince people who haven't experienced that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And you know, it's interesting discussing with you all morning, and knowing that you're not Jewish, but you understand anti-Semitism. I don't think you can convince anyone who isn't prepared to listen. That's sort of the thing that I keep reiterating. But you really have to navigate whether or not you're having a good faith conversation with someone. And there's no point, I don't find there to be any point in talking to the non-Jewish world if it is only creating dialogue around something really just to bully the Jew and to punish what it deems to be the oppressor in the situation. And you know, one of our biggest challenges that we have as Jews is that we now live in a society that monopolizes victimhood and that celebrates victimhood. And Jewish identity isn't about victimhood. It's about resilience, it's about pride, it's about survival. You know, I was at Yad Vashem a couple of weeks ago. I hadn't been to Israel in about 6 years. And I was doing a tour of Yad Vashem, and I can't remember if I had any kind of like tangible memory of how I felt in the museum before, but suffice to say, it was my first time in the museum as an activist for Jews and understanding my role. And I sat with myself afterwards and thought about what my reaction to the museum was and how I felt when I left. And of course, there are feelings of anger, there are feelings of, you know, how dare you at the world, you know, because I really feel that viscerally. But I also felt hugely proud when I left the museum. I felt really proud. I didn't feel like going out in the world and saying, look what they did to us, you know, we're victims, and our continued victimhood requires reparations upon us, and you owe us for the rest of time. I'm not thinking about that at all. I was thinking about how incredible it is to look out at Jerusalem and see what the Jewish people who have come to Israel have created in that country, to see what we've done in the diaspora. We've rebuilt our communities in other places, in countries that, thank God, have welcomed us and let us exist safely for a period of time. And this is not attractive to the current ways in which people dialogue about society, because we live in these oppression hierarchies now, and it's about who's the biggest victim, and we have to pay most attention to that voice. And people don't want to hear us because we're survivors and we're imperfect victims, because we're strong and we have a strong nation, and that's problematic, you know. So for me, I find that I can really I can't talk about anti-Semitism from the place of victimhood. I can only talk about my Jewish pride and my Jewish identity, and I'm only willing to do that with people in the non-Jewish world who are prepared to hear me and to have an honest and oftentimes uncomfortable conversation.
It's interesting. I've written down imperfect victims. It's very good. You talked about before about having that conversation with non-Jews. You don't want to engage in an honest conversation because so much of the Palestine activism, including from Palestinians, but including their fellow travellers, they're increasingly less nuanced in their accusations about Israel, and it forces those of us who want to have a nuanced conversation about Israel, about Zionism, including Jewish identity in the diaspora. Suddenly we're just having to say, well, it's not colonialism, it's not apartheid, and we're forced into these black and white spaces. I mean, have you found, is there like a magic pill? Like, how do you have these conversations? How do you cut through and want to engage in a nuanced way?
My way of, I guess I have more skill as a writer than I do as an orator in that regard, because I have more time to sit with how it creates drama. And the best thing about Twitter and Instagram is that you can actually be pretty provocative and you can create something dramatic. And I believe in dramatic language. I think it works. And I think sometimes you might have to go to places that you might have to explain a bit better. You might have to understand that people are going to have quite an extreme reaction to something that you've said, but then it opens up the space to have a conversation. Oh my God, what did she just say? You know, what did she just tweet? Like, what's this Instagram post about? And then suddenly you're having a conversation about it. Because all we see all the time is we're being bulldozed with these terms constantly, and they all sound really smart and, you know, intellectual. And you walk around and talk about colonialism and genocide and ethnic cleansing, and oh my God, you must be such a good person. Look what you're doing in the world. You're ridding us of all of these big words. You know, it sounds really like it's got to do with bad people. And Israel, wow, that you know, great. Keep passing around this narrative. It's so great. It's really easy to tweet. It fits into the 280 characters. You know, great hashtags stem from this thing. You've got all of these influencers. It's so easy for them to echo this. It's so noisy out there. So the only way to cut through that noise is to somehow find a distraction or something dramatic that rips through it. And you know, an example of mine is that, and I spoke about this at Mind's Focus earlier this morning, is that I wrote an article for the Tablet magazine in May last year during the beginning of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, or not the beginning of the conflict, but you know, a rise in activity, and I gave it a controversial title, and a lot of people were very unhappy about it, and a lot of people really related to it, and I wanted to unpack it and understand what it meant. So I called this article the Social Media Pogrom, and it stemmed from a conversation I was having with an old friend of mine who is an educator and has worked in the realm of anti-Semitism for the past 20 years. And I was talking about what was happening to us online, and you know, the internet in its current iteration, as it affects all of our lives and lives in our pockets and dictates to us where we go in the morning and what we're doing in the evening, it's taken over our lives in a way that we can't live without it. And this is the first time in history that Jews have dealt with a conflict that challenges our land and our nation, not just our nationhood, but our identity on a global scale, because it then manifests. The conversation manifests as such in the mainstream media that all of us are feeling the heat wherever we are in the diaspora. I thought to myself, well, if the internet is a fundamental part of our lives, and it's not just this thing that lives on a laptop, and it's a place where we all commune and socialize, then really, if pogroms were happening in physical spaces to expel Jews, is this thing that's happening to us online basically like a digital pogrom? Because we're being erased, our accounts are being attacked, they're being taken down. Jews cannot proliferate a challenge to the narrative in mainstream media. All of our posts that explain what Zionism is, they're all being taken down for violating community guidelines, but they're not violent. It's just facts. So what's happening here? This is really strange. This feels like we are being actively erased and expelled from online platforms. So people saw the social media pogrom, and the way that online discourse works is, you think that being cancelled on Twitter is as bad as your ancestors being forced out of their homes and villages in Poland. No, that's not what I said. That's not what I said. What I said is we have to look at the social phenomenon of what's happening now and understand it in the context of history. It's really important, because what we have as Jews is a repeated pattern of behaviour that, fortunately or unfortunately, has impacted us through every generation. And it's in understanding that we can predict how endangered we are right now and what we have to do about it. And that's what I've chosen to use my platform to do, is to wake Jews up in many ways. And that's, so to answer your question, that article did break through the noise because it shook people. And for some people, it was something they really wanted to hear, and for some people, it was really something they didn't, but it created a new conversation.
What we found is individuals work better on social media than organisations. And so the collective Melbourne Jewish community organisation is sort of in this room, and we all struggle in social media. We try, we do stuff and it goes nowhere. You have a platform, but the activists on the other side have a massive platform. As you pointed out, they have followers that are more numerous than the number of Jewish people on the planet. I mean, how do we get non-Jewish individuals to start retweeting our stuff? Like, how do you cut through and get why is it Jews against the world?
I don't mean to be a real pessimist here, but when it comes to the digital landscape, we have already lost the war. And I think that we really have to accept that. This is a David and Goliath battle, and we can't compete with them in the same way. We're not going to compete with them in numbers. We're going to compete with them in message and in facts, and the people who want to find the facts and know the truth, they're going to find it because we're going to be there, and we're going to have leaders in our spaces, and we're going to have courageous Jews who are prepared to put out the real message and who know the truth and can educate those who want to hear it. But what I'm more interested in, rather than fighting anti-Semitism, because again, I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but we're also losing that war, and we have for thousands of years, is to empower Jews. I'm not trying, people laugh when I say it, but I'm really not trying to fight anti-Semitism, even though that's what it looks to be what I'm doing every day. What I'm trying to do is give Jewish people, and non-Jewish people who want to speak up, the verbiage to do so, the compulsion to do so, in whichever flair and flavour and way they want to do it. To me, that's where we have to sort of redraw the lines of the battlefield, so to speak, because we're, as I said, 0.02% of the global population, and at that, how many of us are online? And at that, how many of us actually use the internet for this purpose and or have an already established large following and platform? Very few of us. So we are never going to match their numbers or their popularity. And at the end of the day, something that I take immense comfort from is that Jews have always been countercultural, really. Like, we've kind of never really been cool. We've never been the cool guy. There was a blip of time in which somebody once put it to me as it is such a woefully bad combination of words, but they called it the post-Holocaust glow that existed. So, you know, there was maybe a blip of time in which there was something kind of cool around Jews, but it wasn't to benefit us. It was to look good, you know, or to look like morally righteous people at the end of the day, which is what got us into the mess of the Holocaust in the first place. So, you know, I feel like for us, we have to accept that we are always countercultural and start from there, rather than trying to, you know, people often ask me, oh, Bella Hadid and, you know, Dua Lipa is such a massive pop star. Like, what are we going to do about Dua? I'm like, let Dua do her thing. You know, she's a great pop star. She makes great music. She looks awesome in a music video. That's her shtick. She's going to do this on the side. It's going to create noise, whatever. It's not the main problem. The main problem is giving Jews the tools to fight this and making sure that they understand, you know, what the legacy of Never Again actually is.
Love it. Well, that's why you're in Melbourne, to help the community, to speak to the youth, and unfortunately, although I could speak to you all day, we do have to wrap this up. So can I ask everyone, please, do you thank each one of us?